What were the biggest keys for St. Louis having the season they had? Which players flew under the radar, and how does the goaltending situation impact this series? We take a look at some St. Louis Blues talkers ahead of today's Game 1 against the Wild today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a special crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues, the playoff preview, as we gear up for the opening round series between the Minnesota Wild and the St. Louis Blues. Both shows part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And thank you for tuning in and making Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues your first listen each and every day. Before we dive into all of the matchups, all of the specifics, everything that could turn the tide for either team one way or the other, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. My name is Seth, host of Locked on Wild, veteran captain of the show, and here to bring you through what should be an entertaining series between the Wild and the Blues. And I'm joined by one half of the dynamic duo of Locked on Blues, Tommy Welch. Welcome. We have known that this matchup was going to happen for a long time, but now we finally get to dig in and get into the specifics of what will be, the best series of the first round of the playoffs. So welcome, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Seth. It's always a pleasure. We're talking about BetOnline and like betting odds and all that stuff, right? The last time I checked, I think the Minnesota Wild are the favorites in the matchup against the St. Louis Blues. So not saying I'm offended, but I'm a little bit offended. I think the Blues have a good track record against the Minnesota Wild, and for BetOnline and other betting companies to go out there and say that Minnesota's the favorite. I mean, obviously, the rankings in the season speak to what happened this year, but I don't know. I think there's a little chip on my shoulder, so we'll see how that plays into this episode.
BetOnline, for what it's worth, has the Blues at plus 135 in this series. So some good value there, and it's going to be just the most epic series that you could possibly have. And so we're going to hit all the angles, both teams. And since the Wild were able to end up winning against Colorado to take home field advantage, we will start at the XL Energy Center today when everyone is listening to this. So, Tommy, if you've got some Wild questions for me to get the Locked on Blues audience a little more familiar with their opponent, I'm an open book.
Okay, so my first question right off the bat is, the Blues are obviously one of the deepest teams in the league. 9 20 goal scorers on the season. I think with the trade deadline, the Blues obviously wanted to add at the blue line and help on their defensive side of the puck. Obviously, it's kind of been up and down with Jordan Binnington this season, but they do have Ville Husso to lean on. So if you were going to pick one facet of the game, any of those three, or maybe something completely off the wall, where do you think the holes lie in this Blues team that Minnesota Wild can pinpoint and potentially lead them to victory in this series?
It's a good question. I think I'm going to go with the goaltending, because I don't get the sense in this series that either team is going to really lock down the opposing offense. You've got two of the best offensive clubs in the entirety of the NHL. And so I think both teams are going to get opportunities to score, and they're going to score. The biggest question for me is that Husso really doesn't have the playoff pedigree yet. And so is he going to rise to the occasion, or is the moment going to be a little too big for him? Now, you've got Jordan Binnington, who's been there before. And so if anything were to happen where Husso struggles, or, you need to make the switch, you've got a guy that's more than capable of of stepping in. If the Wild are going to win this series, they're going to have to prevent what happened against Vegas last year happening again, where you get a goalie that's standing on his head and preventing the team from getting anything past him. So if they can get to Husso early, they can get to him often. I think that is the biggest opportunity for the Wilds, and I don't get the sense that they're going to truly be able to fully shut down this Blues team. So they're going to need to score some goals themselves. And so if they can get past that goalie tandem, they're going to be able to hang in this thing just fine.
Okay, I like that. And so speaking to the goalie tandem that the Minnesota Wild have, obviously Cam Talbot's had a pretty good season. You bring in Marc-Andre Fleury for a little bit of added protection. You talk about playoff pedigree, that dude's got about as much as you can ask for. And the Blues this season, unfortunately, did not see a lot of him in a Minnesota Wild uniform. So do you think that could be kind of a wild card for the Wild, no pun intended, if they bring in Marc-Andre Fleury to face the St. Louis Blues instead of Cam Talbot? Or how do you think the Wild's tandem could potentially factor into this series?
I think you've got two very different dynamics for the goalie position. You got Cam Talbot, who has been very steady. He's been a very calming presence in net for this team. He's not a guy that can necessarily like steal you a game like Fleury can, where he's just, making all the insane acrobatic saves and truly shutting a team out. But he's very capable of holding good offenses in check. Recent performance for both, I think, leads to Talbot getting the edge. At least that's the way I would do it. But it's a great problem to have a guy like Marc-Andre Fleury, who has done it a million times in the postseason and has performed well with the Wild. He did have a little bit of a rough stretch, but that final game against the Avs, he looked great. So I get the sense we'll see both guys. I think at least early on, the Wild will start with Cam Talbot just because when Fleury has been beaten, it seems like teams get to him right away. He had a couple of starts against the Kraken where they scored within the first 2 minutes of the game. They scored twice. Los Angeles Kings scored 3 times early on in that game. And so that concerns me going into the playoffs, is getting jumped by a team right away. So I think they go Talbot to start. But if something happens to Talbot, Marc-Andre Fleury is ready and waiting to hop in and try to even the tide.
I like that. I like that a lot. And so, okay, you talk about evening the tide. So I feel like there's been one guy on the Minnesota Wild that has a lot of tides, and they're either high or low, and it feels like he's on a massive bender right now. That is Kevin Fiala. Is he done with his high tide? Can we safely say that the Blues will be safe from the wrath of Kevin Fiala, or is this just going to segue into the playoffs and we're going to be on the outside looking in because Kevin Fiala had a 4-goal performance and single-handedly beat us?
So it's one thing to be on a heater, but I tried to find a term to go above that. And so I've been saying that Kevin Fiala is on an eliter. He's been on an insane scoring pace. He's got 25 goals in his last 40 games, something like that. And just career highs up and down the board. And him, Freddie Gaudreau, and Matt Boldy, you look at that line and you're like, those guys aren't, they're not world beaters, but they've scored on everybody. And that is the biggest difference between last year's postseason and this year's postseason, is that the Wild have 2 elite scoring lines that can beat you. So if you try to shut the Kaprizov line down, the Fiala line is going to have plenty of opportunities. If you try to shut the Fiala line down, the Kaprizov line is going to have their opportunities too. It's a pick your poison type approach, but Fiala has just, the dynamic level of scoring that he's brought is something that I really haven't seen with this franchise before. It's Kaprizov-like. And you look at Kaprizov and what he's done, it is a nightmare combo.
He's been all right, I think, right?
Yeah, he's done all right. It's been a nightmare combo, and so good luck trying to stop both of them, because that has been the one thing, at least through the regular season, the last couple of games. And there have been a lot of teams that have tried. There really hasn't been anybody who has put together a solid formula to slow both of them down. It's usually one or the other. But if those guys both get rolling in this series, it's going to be dicey.
So speaking of getting rolling, do you think with how much everyone's talking about the Blues depth and 920 goal scorers and the names they have up and down this roster, do you feel like the Minnesota Wild are getting kind of the short end of the stick there because they're a pretty deep team as well, but they're not getting the recognition because of their opponent?
I think that's a great take. And you look at what this Wild team did. I mean, you've got 3 20-goal scorers on that top line. You've got Matt Boldy, who played like half the season, and he ended up with 15 goals. Freddie Gaudreau has, I believe, 15 goals himself. Those bottom 2 lines do some different things than just purely score. You've got the Eriksson Ek, Greenway, and Foligno line, which is the best shutdown defensive line in the NHL in 5-on-5. So a lot of times they are being put on the ice to try to slow down an opponent's top line. The Delorier, Duhaime, and Jost line is out there to fight. And so those guys, they have had scoring opportunities for sure, but those top 2 lines have really been the only ones that have been carrying this team. And not to say that the Grief line can't, because Eriksson Ek had, I think, 26 goals and Foligno had 20 himself. So they're capable of scoring. It's just they're doing some different things when they're out there on the ice as opposed to just trying to bury one in the back of the net. So I think it's a deep, very deep team, on par with what the Blues have. It's just the Blues have, all these guys that can beat you scoring wise, and the Wild just kind of attack it in some different ways.
Yeah. So that being said, if you're betting in this series with the depth scoring that the Blues have and also the depth that the Minnesota Wild have, you definitely need to take the over. And you can do that at BetOnline, because betonline.net is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You can find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action at BetOnline, where the game starts. We'll be right back with this episode of the Minnesota Wild and the Locked On Blues crossover when we come back.
Continuing today's crossover episode of Locked On Wild, Locked On Blues. We call it the playoff primer. And this series getting rolling here tonight. Tommy, I got to ask you, I did, talk about a little bit the goalie combos. What is your confidence level in Ville Husso heading into the start of this series?
It's pretty high, to be honest. When you take a look at the analytics throughout this season, Ville Husso has been one of the top performing goalies since he started making his serious starter campaign, and Jordan Binnington kind of started slowly fading into the background. But even before that, I feel like a lot of people forgot this season that when we were talking about Team Canada and the Olympics, obviously that didn't happen, but Jordan Binnington was like number 1 on that list for starting Team Canada. So he was on a bender and a leader, some might say, at the beginning of this season. But like I said, Ville Husso kind of took the reins and he never looked back. But I think the sample size for Ville Husso and what he's been able to sustain throughout the course of this season is large enough that you feel comfortable with him starting game 1 in the playoffs. So I know there's been some talk back and forth about who you go with. And I get the argument about Binnington with the experience there, but I think with the sample size that Ville Husso had and the season that he put together, he's earned the right to start game 1 for the St. Louis Blues. And I think he's going to do great. I mean, the guy saves high danger chances like it's going out of style. He's doing exactly what the Blues thought with his projection and being a top-rated goalie. It's going to put us in a difficult position at the end of the season when he's a UFA. But for the time being, I think Ville Husso has what it takes to lead a team to the Stanley Cup. And so hopefully if the Blues move on from the Minnesota Wild, he can do that in dynamic fashion.
You've got, as you alluded to, all these options that can score, 9 different 20-goal scorers. And a take that you guys had earlier in the season when the Blues were on that just absolute heater that continued all the way to pretty much the end of the year. It sounded like you guys were as impressed, if not a little more impressed, with what this team has done defensively, as opposed to, what the offense has been able to do all season. Does that still ring true heading into this postseason series? Is the Blues defense, has it been on par with what their offense has been able to do?
Well, that's a very good question, Seth. So we talked about the defense on Locked On Blues the entire season. And the biggest reason is because we didn't trust it. You lost Pietrangelo, you lost Jay Bouwmeester, you lost so many guys on the defensive side of the puck. Alexander Steen was obviously not a defenseman, but he was a defensive forward through and through. And then you trade away Oscar Sundqvist and Jake Wallman. And so there's a lot of names there that were key parts of 2019 St. Louis Blues that won the Stanley Cup. And the biggest impact on that team was its defense. Now we're looking at a team, like you said, 920 goal scorers. And Jordan Kyrou skated faster than Connor McDavid at the All-Star game. He's on our third line right now. Jeez. So if that tells you how deep this team is, it's just absolutely insane. And it's awesome for Blues fans because we haven't seen an offense like this since we're talking like Brett Hull, like Adam Oates. Like, it has been a long time since the Blues were an offense first team, but that kind of frustrates you when you look at the defense because there's so many times that you're going to end up winning games like 6-5 or 5-4. And you're just like pulling your hair out because there's so many pucks going in the net. So I would say I liked the addition of Leddy at the trade deadline. I think it helped a lot getting Krug back, getting guys healthy. I think is huge for this team. Marco Scandella lately has been playing out of his mind, and much more like the player that he looked like when we first traded for him at the deadline. I think it was last year. Partnered up with Colton Parayko, and they went on like a 10-game win streak. Since that time, he's kind of lackluster. We were laying into him earlier this season because his play just wasn't there, and he felt like the weak link. But he doesn't feel like that right now. And Rosen has come in and been an impact as well. So I think the Blues defense since the trade deadline has been a lot better than it was before. And I think that gives us hope as a team because we know that the offense is going to come out and ball out every single game.
Just looking at the top couple of lines, I had to minimize this window because it actually made me ill. You've got Buchnevich, Thomas, and Tarasenko. You got Brandon Saad, Ryan O'Reilly, and David Perron. And then, like you said, Jordan Kyrou on the third line. Of all of those 20-goal scorers, which one surprised you the most?
Man, I think you got to go Robert Thomas because I think watching him play over the last couple of years, and it's not to say that I never thought that he'd be a 20-goal scorer, but I did not think it would happen this year because I think he had like 5 goals at the trade deadline or something ridiculous. And since that time, he just went on a tear and he was getting assists left and right, having like 4-point nights. And the next thing you know, like the biggest thing for Robert Thomas was always like, if you're in the slot position, if you're in a scoring position, like he's always pass first guy, wants to get that assist. That's great. Like great teammate setting up your buddies. But sometimes I'd love for you to shoot the puck. Like he had a very sneaky wrist shot that had a lot of speed on it and a lot of action, but he never really used it. And Jordan Binnington would talk about it on podcasts. I think it was Missing Curfew. They were like, who has the best shot on the team? He's like, obviously it's Vladdy, but like Kyrou and Thomas have good shots as well. And I was like, oh, really? Because we don't see Robert Thomas's very much. Well, lo and behold, the dude's been on a tear, and he's not only getting assists, but he's also scoring goals. And when you're a playmaker like Robert Thomas, whose goal is to pass first, when you can shoot the puck and score the puck as well, just going to open up those passing lanes even more. So I think that's the most surprising to me. But also, Ivan Barbashev was a bottom 6 guy as well. And I don't think he ever even sniffed close to 20 goals. And I never thought that he'd be like a scoring threat for this team, but he's had a career year. The dude bangs bodies like no other. He's got to be up there if he's not leading the team in hits. And he also has over 20 goals too. So you got all those things combined, the working machine and the cogs for the St. Louis Blues team. It's got to make you feel pretty confident going up against anybody.
Final one before we look at some of the true X factors in this series. The final game between these two teams in the regular season featured the Blues getting out to a 4-1 lead, and then the Wild scoring 2 goals in the blink of an eye twice in the third period to tie it up and send the game into overtime. With the amount of experience that the Minnesota Wild have in overtime games, I believe they are 15. I think they're 15-7 in overtime and shootout games this year. And the Blues obviously have way more regulation wins, haven't gone to overtime as much. With the fact that the Wild have so much experience in those types of games, does that concern you at all heading into this series?
It does, because I think the Blues record in overtime this year was not the best. And 3-on-3 hockey is obviously very high stakes, and you're always going to lean heavily on those skill guys because they're going to have a lot of room, obviously. Like if you send out Fiala and Kaprizov, like as much as I love the Blues and as much as like Tarasenko, Robert Thomas, like Buchnevich, like those guys are studs. I mean, that is a tough matchup, right? So I think like initially, if the Blues can kind of work the puck and like maintain the puck and get shifts out, like the more lines that they send out there and the more lines that the Wild send out there, I think will benefit them in the long run. But that first line staring down the barrel of the gun at you it's intimidating to anybody, especially with that much ice.
Oh man, this series is going to be just.
There might be. You were talking about 5 of the games going to OT, 7-game series.
Yeah, I have a scorcher of a take in that department. And so we'll finish up our crossover episode by taking a look at some of the X factors for both teams in this series. Plenty more to come in our pre-series crossover between Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues after this. But first, it is the month of May, which means that it is time to get back outside, be active, and enjoy some much better weather. You're going to need to find a go-to snack that you can take with you wherever you're headed. Built Bar is that go-to snack. The best part about a Built Bar is it's both healthy and delicious. You're not sacrificing delicious food just for the sake of eating healthy. With Built Bar, you can truly have both, and it is easy. All you have to do is head to built.com and order your Built Bars now. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, which means that with Built Bar, you can eat healthy and actually enjoy doing it. Typically, Built Bars have right around 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Your standard candy bar, way more than that. 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. So kick your bad candy habit and head to Built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. Again, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Final segment of today's crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues. Once your first listen is done, make sure you check out both shows for as much intel on this series as you possibly can, because it's going to be an absolute barn burner between these two teams. Tommy, let's look at some of the true X factors, the swing players, as it were, that could really impact this series. And so if you've got one or two for the Blues, let's start there. And then I have a couple for the Minnesota Wild that I think will turn the tide too.
Well, I think the number one for me, and I think I mentioned it on Locked on Blues, it absolutely, without a doubt, 100%. I think, honestly, the weight of this entire series might weigh entirely on Jordan Kyrou's shoulders. And the reason I say that is because, obviously, Jordan Kyrou went on an absolute tear at the beginning of the season. Since that time, he's kind of cooled off, and he kind of went through something similar last season with the St. Louis Blues. But when the guy is on, he provides the same impact that Robert Thomas does. It's like I said, looking down the barrel of the gun, like he intimidates like a guy like Kaprizov, like a guy that can blow past you with his speed, can beat you with his hands, can beat goalies with his shot, but he can also pass around you and get teammates wide open. That is what Jordan Kyrou brings to the table when he's firing on all cylinders. He hasn't been there lately, but he did score a goal in the last game of the season. So hopefully that gets the wheels turning in the right direction for him in the playoffs. But I think the matchup on the third line for the St. Louis Blues is going to be huge because I feel like that's the biggest gap personally for me between the St. Louis Blues and the Minnesota Wild, and where they could potentially exploit the Wild and their depth. So obviously Ivan Barbashev will play a role in that as well, but I think Jordan Kyrou has the most potential to make a serious impact, especially in terms of scoring and what he brings to the table.
My X factor in this series is Marcus Foligno. He was injured in the final game of the regular season.
Knee on knee, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it looked awful to the point where we're like, well, he's probably done for the year. He practiced this weekend and got some good news from the team doctors to the point where he is probably going to end up playing in game one, which is just the guy's just an absolute freak, and is just playing through some unbelievable injuries that he has accumulated over the course of the season. My concern is whether or not he's going to be anywhere near full Marcus Foligno levels, because you put him with Joel Eriksson Ek and Jordan Greenway, which seems like kind of an odd assortment of players, but for whatever reason, when those three are on the ice, they just hit a different level of performance that has locked down some of the best lines in hockey. Wild are going to need him to be on his A game for this series, because it turns out the Blues have a lot of guys that can score. And so you got to try to slow down, that top line and at least kind of knock them off their game. And then you take your chances with the Kaprizov line and the Fiala line being able to match what the other two Blues lines that are capable of scoring can also do. So Marcus Foligno, I think, is the biggest X factor for me, because if he's just kind of a decoy out there, we're going to be able to tell, and the Blues are going to be able to take advantage of that. If somehow he is operating at near full strength, that's a difference maker for this Wild team, especially one that's going to need a little defense. And then Jonas Brodin is another one I would throw into. The guy's clamped down Connor McDavid every time the Wild have matched up with the Oilers. And so he's going to need to do that to one of those guys, is just put the clamps on somebody and prevent them from scoring. So those are my X factors. And all in all, I get the sense that this is going to be a full heavyweight tilt between these two teams.
Yeah, I'm excited. It feels like the rest of the hockey world is excited. I mean, you're talking about a first round matchup of the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Toronto Maple Leafs. There's a lot of teams matching up in the first round that are absolute studs that feel like they could be round 3 matchups. And I feel like Minnesota Wild and the St. Louis Blues fit right into that category. But there's one similarity I feel like it's kind of been happening with the St. Louis Blues and the Wild. I feel like every time we play each other, Seth, we're going back and forth on Twitter because we just always beat you guys. And I don't want to say that as like, oh, like in your face kind of thing, but it reminds me a lot of the St. Louis Blues when we would play the Chicago Blackhawks in the playoffs. And every year they'd knock us out. And I'd be like, God, please just let us play anyone besides the Blackhawks any day and we can compete. But lo and behold, we play the Blackhawks one time. We look like we've never touched a puck in our life, right? But that one goal by Troy Brouwer will live in infamy in St. Louis Blues lore because it got the monkey off the back. And we finally beat the dreaded Chicago Blackhawks. And it felt like their relevance since then has just gone absolutely down the toilet. So I'm not going to come out here and say that the Minnesota Wild are absolutely going to beat the St. Louis Blues because both these teams are absolutely stacked, right? But if you guys do beat us, I feel like that moment will happen and the emotions will be the same for you. And I'm not going to come out here and say that I want that for you guys, but I'm also not going to say that that wouldn't be cool, right? So if the St. Louis Blues lose to the Minnesota Wild, I'm going to tell you right now, as host of Locked On Blues, I'm going to be rooting for you guys to go and win the Stanley Cup 1,000%.
That's what I love to hear. playoff futility is something that I really can't speak to because we have a team here in Minnesota that has lost 18 consecutive playoff games to the New York Yankees. And so if you think that that doesn't get in your head, it makes the Wild Blues results over the last, handful of years. It makes that seem secondary when you lose 18 consecutive games to one team. Like, the Wild have not done that. They have had plenty of first round exits. 2016, 2017, certainly one that a lot of Wild fans will remember because it was against the St. Louis Blues. And it was a Blues team that was, I think, a wild card at that point. So it has happened where the Wild have had tremendous amounts of success and then end up losing in the first round. I get the sense that this series is going to be very close because of how those last two matchups went. This wasn't the Winter Classic where the Wild had, who knows, a handful of players out. This is going to be as even as it gets, which is why I'm on record as saying it's going to be a 7-game series. 5 of those games are going to overtime.
I don't know if I can take that, Seth. I hope you're wrong.
I'm
going to have heart problems at the end of it.
Oh, I'm going to be an absolute mess if we even have like one overtime game between these two teams. But all in all, it's going to be an incredible series between these two teams. And so make sure that you are following along with both Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues to keep you up to date through it. Both shows available as part of the Locked On Podcast Network with new episodes every Monday through Friday. That's going to do it for our playoff preview. We'll have plenty on both shows to get you through this series. We'll probably do some sort of a crossover during the series as well. Lots of options out there on the table. And so make sure to keep up to date with your favorite teams with both shows. Enjoy, and we will catch up with you on the newest episode of both Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues.